My name is Rhea Doolan. I am the Senior Policy Lead at the First Nations Technology Council in British Columbia, and I am a citizen of the Nisga'a Nation from the village of Gingolis in the northwest coast of BC. I'm also Tsimshian, also from the northwest coast, from the village of Metlakatla, and I also have Norwegian, Scottish, and British ancestry. The central focus of my work as Senior Policy Lead is to provide leadership in national and provincial research, cross-jurisdictional research, policy development, and to provide leadership and advocacy efforts in order to advance the coordination of a comprehensive and collaborative approach to achieving digital equity in BC for First Nations peoples. Our organization specifically operates with a mandate that was provided by 3 different leadership organizations in BC: Chiefs and Assembly from the First Nations Summit, the BC Assembly of First Nations, the Union BC of Indian Chiefs. And so we've been formally mandated since 2002 to operate as a sector council for technology and innovation in BC. There are many things that need to change to ensure digital equity in the future. I would say that on a fundamental level, there's a lot of assumptions that need to be challenged within our society more broadly. Specifically, in the context of the work that I do, there needs to be a shift, and a large major trajectory shift in recognizing that Indigenous peoples are rights holders and not stakeholders. So what that basically means is that we need to have decision-making control, and that we have the right to determine our own digital destinies and to hold decision-making control over both our present and our future, as manifested and guided by the use of digital and connected technology. So the work that we undertake at this organization, we are in the process of co-developing an Indigenous digital equity strategy, which is a comprehensive, coordinated, and First Nations-led initiative that directly supports First Nations inherent rights. And we're undertaking this work in recognition that we have the right to own, control, access, influence, and steward digital technology, to influence and benefit from participation in all sectors that are impacted by or rely on digital and connected technologies. And we also have the right to provide leadership in the reformation of policies and laws and regulations concerning digital technologies, especially when they impact or have the potential to impact First Nations title rights and treaty rights. As it's currently perceived, because we're living in a society that has a normalized expectation that when we talk about connectivity or we talk about technology, that it's acceptable to have it entirely driven by private sector market-driven models, especially when it comes to things related to connectivity in particular. So until we have that fundamental shift in understanding, with the private sector, they have an obligation, for instance, under TRC 92, to understand UNDRIP and to actually work in partnership with First Nations peoples. And further to that too, every level of government, federally and provincially, has an obligation now under legislative commitment under UNDRIP to ensure that their laws and policies and approaches are in alignment with that. So until we get to that space where we're not considered an approach to stakeholders, where we're started to be recognized as rights holders, I don't see the possibility for there to be true digital equity. Because basically what I'm coming down to say is that Indigenous digital equity is a different definition from traditional equity approaches. Equity approaches most often assume that everybody is seeking the same goals or is coming from the same context, and they're not. In Canada, First Nations and Indigenous peoples hold inherent rights that existed prior to colonization. And as such, we have the right to operate as sovereign nations. And if we're talking about that on a digital equity perspective, we're not just talking about the individual equity level, we're talking about equity on par as sovereign, self-determining nations in digital equity spaces. So those would be some of my major needs to actually fully realize digital equity. think the best advice I could possibly give would be to challenge assumptions both on a personal level that we've been taught through living in this society that as structured as it currently is. And then question assumptions related on a larger societal level. More broadly, it's really been normalized within Western society to have kind of low expectations when it comes to technology and innovation, or even areas around, again, connectivity. The status quo doesn't have to be the status quo. Being innovative and having confidence that you have intelligent contributions to make to the conversation about the values that are being embedded in all of our systems and structures and the technology that we develop. It has really far-reaching impacts, and it's important to, when you're assessing what work you're doing, to not only pay attention to what you're measuring, but what you're not measuring and how you're measuring it, to evaluate whether or not what you're doing is actually going to have a positive impact or not. And as I've spoken to in a previous point, I think specifically when it comes to having kind of any sort of advice for any sort of future selves or future generations, it's just, again, to remind specifically Indigenous youth, they're navigating a system that's exploitive by nature, that they're intelligent and that they're smart, and they've come from peoples of great intelligence and worth and worldviews. And just because people don't understand what you're talking about doesn't mean that it's necessarily wrong. In fact, it's probably, you might be doing something right. So push the boundaries and challenge your assumptions, and just, yeah, that would be my advice. In BC, for context, there's 204 First Nations, 34 language, and over 90 dialects. That is a huge level of diversity. It's over 50%, approximately 50% of the Indigenous languages that are spoken in BC are in this province. Then when you look across the country at all the distinct and unique cultures of Indigenous peoples in Canada, that is a lot of worldviews that were deliberately cut from Canadian history and our education systems and our structures. Those worldviews are grounded in the land. Our worldviews are of value because for generations upon generations, 14,000 years in the case of Tsimshian Nation, First Nation, we have stewarded the land, governed ourselves, and done so in sustainable ways. Even when it comes to our planning and approaches, the reason why language is important is because it encodes our culture and encodes our worldviews. Coding and technology is an extension of language, and it's an extension of the values that you bring to the table and the assumptions that you make. So not including and not having Indigenous leadership providing input into the trajectory of technology and the values that are embedded in it, with all this interactions with technology that we have today, how is your data being used? How is it being collected? Why is it being used this way? All of these assumptions are not driven in the interest of supporting individuals. It's in the interest of corporations making money and informing themselves. And it's become normalized, just like our expectation to have connectivity given to us as a gift, as happy consumers of technology. And that comes with a lot of obligations and stipulations that have far-reaching impact that we don't fully even understand, but we just are expected to check the box and accept it in order to access. And again, our ability to interact with the world is mediated through tools that haven't been written with that kind of ethics or moral lens necessarily. So it's inevitably invaluable to have Indigenous leadership in technology over conversations, not only of like how technology is used, how the codes are written, but how it's regulated, how the policies are implemented, how is funding allocated, these are decisions that would benefit from having, and that we have the right to have input into. And so that's why I believe very strongly that we need to have Indigenous leadership in technology and innovation spaces, shaping the future and trajectory of our communities and presenting different examples of how things can be done in different ways. And that diversity is a benefit. The federal government specifically announced in, I believe, March of 2020, a $2.75 billion investment to guarantee connectivity to every household by 2030 at the speeds of 50-10 megabytes. And unfortunately, there's 2 points that I think are really important. One, really excited to see that this is on the political agenda. This has been something on the minds of First Nations chiefs in BC for endlessly long amount of time. Our organization was a brainchild that started in the 1990s. We formally became mandated to undertake this work in 2002. And we've been advocating from the very beginning for connectivity on Indigenous self-identified terms to meet self-identified goals. Specifically, the view that we're coming from is in recognition that the internet in itself may not necessarily be a human right, but it is a derived right nonetheless. Become a derived human right because it's the means through which people are expected to exercise their individual rights. And in the context of Indigenous communities as sovereign nations, we are also needing it to exercise our sovereign rights as self-determining governments and nations. So this has been something that's been on the mind of the Technology Council and an advocacy issue for decades. And so it's really exciting to see this on the political agenda. The unfortunate fact is that it still replicates the status quo. The methodology of it and how it's been designed, it's from an era pre-UNDRIP legislation, pre-adoption of UNDRIP, and it's also pre-BC's DRIPA Act. So to begin with, their approach has been problematic to begin with because it's not recognizing Indigenous rights and sovereignty to self-determine how they want to have connectivity, how they engage with connectivity, if they want to own infrastructure, if they want to own their own ISP, if they want to have a nonprofit ISP, or if they do want to choose to partner with a different telecom to have service delivered to them. The most important fact of the matter is they need to have informed choice. In BC, particularly, we're rebuilding our governments, rebuilding our nations, and the government has an obligation to support capacity building for us to have these conversations at these tables on an equitable level. And the dedication of $2.75 billion worth of federal funding has largely, at least in the province of BC, largely been kind of put into the hands of telecoms to, again, fulfill piecemeal projects on a last mile basis, whereas our organization, again, is coming from a first mile perspective. The priority should always be to connect the least connectable or the hardest to connect. Because once you do that, then you have the backbone in place. I really would hope to see more involvement and more support with wraparound supports. Again, to digital equity is not just an issue of connectivity. It's not an issue of economic development exclusively. That's another conversation that needs to be changed. It's, again, the means through which rights, both individual and collective, are exercised and enjoyed. And if you don't have equitable access to that, then we don't live in an equitable society. Further to that point too, having standards set at a specific number like 50-10 inevitably stale dates the goal. If we're talking substantive equality, which is equity, there should be a substantively equal expectation to have internet speeds and connectivity to what's available in more densely populated or urban areas. So it's exciting. We're really pleased to see that there's recognition for the importance of connectivity, but the reasons and the approaches so far to date haven't been in alignment, in our view, with UNDRIP.